Chapter 72. Why People Thought Paul Was God. You can read more about this from Acts chapter 14. In the synagogue of Iconium, every Sabbath day, two men got up to talk. Always they talked about the same things, about the Son of God, Jesus, who had come to save his people. Many of the Jews and Greeks of the city believed what the men said, but others did not. After a while, those who did not believe began to make trouble for the missionaries. They even made a plan to stone them. But the two preachers, Paul and Barnabas, found out about it, and they fled to the cities of Lystra and Derbe. At Lystra, there was a man who had been a cripple all his life. He had been born with deformed feet. He had never been able to walk a single step, nor even to stand up. When this man heard Paul speak, he believed. Seeing this, Paul said to him, "Stand upright on your feet." At once the man jumped up. He stood without falling, and even walked. Then the people of the city could not believe that Paul and Barnabas were men, like themselves. They thought they must be gods come down to earth in the form of men. For they believed that their gods often came to earth, and no man could heal a cripple. Barnabas they called Jupiter, and Paul they called Mercury, because he did most of the talking. They started to worship Paul and Barnabas, and to offer sacrifice to them. The priests of Jupiter brought some wreaths of flowers and some oxen for burnt offerings. But as soon as the two disciples heard about this, they ran among the people and called out, "Sirs, do not do this. We are men like yourselves. We have come here to tell you to turn away from such foolishness. Turn away from idols and believe in the true God, who made heaven and earth and all things that are in them." But in spite of all that Paul and Barnabas said, they could hardly keep the people from offering sacrifices. Later, some of the same Jews who had wanted to stone Paul at Iconium came to this city. They told the people bad and untrue things about Paul and Barnabas. The people changed their minds and decided that the two men were not gods, but mischief makers. They threw stones at Paul, whom they had wanted to worship. Finally, when they thought he was dead, they dragged his body out of the city into the fields and went away. Some of the Christians were weeping to see Paul treated so cruelly. They went over to him very lovingly and found to their surprise that he was still breathing, although he had seemed to be dead. After a little while, Paul opened his eyes. Though he was sore and bruised, he was able to get up and go to the house where he had stayed. The next day he and Barnabas left Lystra and went to Derbe. There they preached the gospel and were happy to find that many people believed. Then they went back and visited all the places where they had preached before. They had started a church in each of these cities, and now when they returned, they appointed elders in each church. At last, Paul and Barnabas got into a ship and sailed back to Antioch, to the church that had sent them out. The disciples there called a meeting of all the Christians in that city to listen to what Paul and Barnabas had to say about their missionary journey and how God had turned many heathen to Jesus. Paul and Barnabas stayed a long time, perhaps 6 or 7 years, and preached to the church in Antioch. The two largest churches were the one in Jerusalem, of which James, the brother of Jesus, was head, and the one in Antioch. But small churches were springing up everywhere, in all countries. Isaiah 10, verses 20 through 34. In that day, the remnant of Israel, the survivors of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, A remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Though your people be like the sand by the sea, Israel, only a remnant will return. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. The Lord Almighty, will carry out the destruction decreed upon the whole land. Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty, says. My people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians, who beat you with a rod and lift up a club against you, as Egypt did. Very soon my anger against you will end, and my wrath will be directed to their destruction. The Lord Almighty will lash them with a whip, as when he struck down Midian at the rock of Oreb, and he will raise his staff over the waters, as he did in Egypt. In that day their burden will be lifted from your shoulders, their yoke from your neck. The yoke will be broken because you have grown so fat. They enter Iath. They pass through Migron. They store supplies at Michmash. They go over the pass and say, we will camp overnight at Geba. Ramah trembles. Gibeah of Saul flees. Cry out, daughter Galim. Listen, Lisha. Poor Anatoth. Madmenah is in flight. The people of Gebim take cover. This day they will halt at Nob. They will shake their fist at the mountain of daughter Zion, at the hill of Jerusalem. See, the Lord Almighty, will lop off the boughs with great power. The lofty trees will be felled. The tall ones will be brought low. He will cut down the forest thickets with an axe. Lebanon will fall before the Mighty One. Pendulum-like, the prophecy focuses again upon the righteous remnant who will be saved. Although this people are to be as the sands of the sea, there will be only a remnant to return from the Babylonian captivity. But they will truly rely upon the Holy One of Israel. Then, like lightning, verse 22 flashes upon us. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. If the theme of desolation and apparently wanton destruction jars us, as we sometimes find to be the case, we will be brought up short here. The destruction God has decreed may be overwhelming, but it is also righteous. Our God does all things well. If he chooses to discipline his own people, even as he punishes the godless nations, he does it in righteousness. His holy name must be guarded. Men cannot be allowed to get away with saying, "How can a just and loving God?" Or, if God is loving, how come he allows? In our sin and ignorance, we may feel uncomfortable when we contemplate God's acts of destruction. For example, his spewing out of hot lava from Mount St. Helens. But we may never look down our noses at him. Nor may we claim a contrast between the God of the Old Testament as full of wrath and the God of the New Testament as so loving. He is one God, unchanging and righteous, whether in his love or his wrath. Both aspects of his nature are seen throughout Scripture. And there will be a remnant. God's people were given the promise that soon his anger against them would end and would be directed against their enemies. He would lop off the boughs. He would fell the lofty trees and bring the tall ones low. He would cut down the forest thickets with an axe. Lebanon would fall before him. Sometimes we shudder as we read the daily newspaper. Viewing television is an awful experience. We feel dwarfed and impotent against the powers of evil that loom on every side. We feel like garden herbs in a forest of redwoods. But God will fell the giant trees. He is sovereign, and the workers of evil can go no further than He permits. One day, these forces of wickedness will be completely demolished. Then we will appreciate as never before how very righteous God is when He destroys evil. Had He not destroyed the evil nations around her, how could Judah have survived as His people, or even as a political entity? How could the Old Testament have been written and preserved? How could the line of the Messiah have been guarded? As His church, we rejoice that God told the nations that crashed like angry waves upon the shores of Judah, "Thus far you may come, and no farther." His destruction is overwhelming and righteous. Bless His name.